This Sikha, in addition to being a Sikha on Parshas Mishpotim, is also a Siyum on Masechta Baba Basra, both Bavli and the Yerushalmi. In the end of the Gemara is speaking about the dinim of a guarantor. Now, usually a guarantor would be, before the person has even made the loan, a person would say that he is guaranteeing the loan, and if the borrower doesn't have the money, then the guarantor is going to pay up. In this particular Mishnah, in the last Mishnah of Baba Basra, the Mishnah says that if the guarantor is on the document but after the signature of the witnesses, which means that the loan really took place without the guarantor only came along later, then not everything could be collected from the guarantor. Not every type of possession will be able to be collected from guarantor. It's what's called only free assets. Possessions that he has available could be collected, but not things that he has already sold, and so on. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yishmael actually had such a case coming up in front of him, and that's the way he paskined that the Orev, this guarantor, you could only collect from him in certain circumstances. Ben Nanos argues with Rabbi Yishmael and says, no, you would not collect from such a guarantor at all any money whatsoever. When Rabbi Yishmael asks why that is, so Ben Nanos gives him the following an example. He says, imagine someone is strangling somebody else in the marketplace. A third party comes along and says, leave him alone and I will pay you. So surely this third party is going to be exempt from paying. He's not considered a guarantor because when the loan took place, the lender had never lent this person the money trusting the guarantor. Instead, what is considered a guarantor that would be obligated? It's only if he came along in the beginning of the loan and the loan was based on his guarantee. The Mishnah then goes ahead and says that Rabbi Yishmael praised Ben Nanos. He said, someone that wants to be wise should learn dinei mamanis, monetary matters. And he then said, and if you want to do dinei mamanis properly, you should learn or serve under Ben Nanos. The Gemara then goes on to say that Rabbi Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that even though Rabbi Yishmael praised Ben Nanos, yet the halacha is like Rabbi Yishmael, which means that in this case of the Orev, of the guarantor, being there after the witnesses had signed, he would still be considered a guarantor to some extent. Then the Gemara asks, what does Rabbi Yishmael actually say about that case of someone being strangled? What would he hold then? As the Rashbam explains it, we might say that because of the pain that he sees his friend is in that's being choked, so now he's completely committing himself to pay, the guarantor is completely committing himself to pay, or you could say, no, he's just trying to do a mitzvah, but he the lender never lost any money because of him, and therefore the guarantor is not obligated to pay. The Gemara concludes that Rabbi Yishmael would argue in this case as well and say that this guarantor has to pay. Yet, as the Gemara continues afterwards and finishes off the Gemara and says that in this particular case, since it's after the loan, and in this case of strangulation, the guarantor would only have to pay if he made what's called a kinyan. In other words, not only a verbal commitment, but he actually made a proper kinyan, an act of accepting this upon himself. Now, in the Yerushalmi brings basically a very similar idea, but the way that Rebbe learns the ending of the Yerushalmi is that Yerushalmi doesn't bring this idea about a kinyan at all, and therefore, according to the Yerushalmi, would come out in the way the Rebbe explains the end of the Yerushalmi, which we're not going to go into all the details right now, but the bottom line is that according to Yerushalmi, in this case of strangulation, the guarantor would be obligated even if he did not make a kinyan. So again, bottom line from what we have in the Bavli and Yerushalmi is in this case, if someone is strangling somebody else, a guarantor comes along and says, leave him alone and I'll pay. According to the Bavli, he would have to pay only if he made a kinyan. According to Yerushalmi, even if there was no kinyan made whatsoever. And in this Sikha, the Rebbe wants to explain this machloikas. In order to understand this, the Rebbe says that there's two ways of understanding how a guarantor ever obligates himself. How did it become his problem? What's it causing that he's now obligated to pay the money? One way of understanding it is that because the lender had spent money because of him, he caused the lender to spend the money, so that's causing now that he is obligating himself to pay the loan. Another way of understanding it is that it's because of the pleasure that he, the Orev, the guarantor, has, that this lender is trusting him. In other words, the lender is going to lend someone money because he trusts him. It is this hana that now causes that he's ready to commit himself and to obligate himself. Says the Rebbe, this would be the difference in the case of someone strangling someone else. If we say the whole reason is because the lender had spent money because of the guarantor, well, here he didn't give out the money because of the guarantor. The guarantor only came along later when this guy was strangling the other person. And that would be the way the Bavli goes, and that's why the only way the guarantor would be obligated is if he actually made a kinyan, he did more of an act to take this commitment, but not just this verbal commitment. But the Yerushalmi would go along with the way that it's because of the hana, because of the pleasure that the guarantor has from the lender trusting him. So here too there's a pleasure. Either the pleasure that he's causing another yid now not to be choked, not to be strangled, or the pleasure that the lender is actually trusting him and letting go of the borrower who he's trying to strangle. Says the Rebbe, why does the Bavli look at it in one way and the Yerushalmi another way? This would really be connected to a general difference between Bavel, the people in Bavel and the people in Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara says that the main idea of Yidden being arevim zelazeh, guarantors for each other in matters of Torah and mitzvahs, mainly happened when the Yidden crossed the Yarden. It is only once the Yidden went into the Eretz Yisrael that they got they got defined as a tzibur, as one unit, as one body. And therefore they became obligated for each other. That was Dafka when they came into Eretz Yisrael. Now, even though, of course, now the din of Yidden being responsible for each other applies in all places, even not in Eretz Yisrael, nevertheless, the ultimate idea of a tzibur, of a proper community, congregation as one, and the idea of arvus is going to be more so in Eretz Yisrael. Says the Rebbe, therefore, in Bavel, Talmud Bavli in Bavel, because the arvus, this idea of people being responsible for others, is not felt in such a strong way. Therefore, we would say that to become an Arev, you would need this action of a kinyan. Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, where the achdus is felt much more, so then you wouldn't need this action of a kinyan, but rather it's enough the fact that you're receiving hana. In other words, even the fact just that I'm in deriving pleasure from the fact that I was now able to save this other person, that itself is enough for the guarantor to be committing himself. That's why the Yerushalmi is of the opinion that you wouldn't even have to make a kinyan. The Rebbe explains this more al derech hamusar. The Rebbe says, when Yidden are in Eretz Yisrael as one body, as one unit, then it's much more revealed how what affects one Yid really impacts the other Yid. If one Yid is in pain, the other Yid is really touched by it. And therefore that would be sufficient that the second Yid devotes himself and obligates himself to remove the other person's pain. And that itself becomes his pleasure, that he can remove the other Yid's pain, because they're like one body. But in Bavel, where the Achdus is not felt, is not as revealed, so in order to cause that another Yid, that one Yid should really commit himself completely to the other, it's only if there's actually a loss of money, there was something actually lost. But in the case where the person didn't spend the money because of you, so then you would say you actually have to make a kinyan. It's not going to be just enough that you're deriving some pleasure or you see the person in pain, etc. The Rebbe now moves on and explains this in the more ruchni is the ka'avoida. The Gemara tells us that the three bavis, Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, Baba Basra, are really one mesechta called Nezikin. Nezikin, spiritually, is the idea of a galus, where there's these mazikim, these damaging forces of klipa, which hold back Yidden from avodas Hashem. And when we learn Masechta Nezikin, that means learning the halachas of Nezikin and Torah, this gets rid of these damaging forces, the ideas of Klippa, and that brings the Geula. This is why it says that the three Bavis correspond to the three Goliyos and to the three Geulos, which end with the three Batei Mikdash. So Baba Basra would be corresponding to this last Golus. Now the beginning of Baba Basra starts off with Hashutfin, two partners that wanted to make a machitza, wanted to make a separation between themselves. The partners are Kvayochel, Hashem, and Bnei Yisrael. So Golus is a situation where there's a mechitza, there's a divider between them. But the ending of the Masechta represents the end of Golus, and that speaks about the dinim of a guarantor. This represents the achdus, the unity that becomes revealed between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. What happens? As a result of the inappropriate conduct during the time of Golus, the Yidden became, so to speak, in debt or subjugated to the opposite side, the side of Klippa. But since Yidden are Am Kroive, close to Hashem, Hashem becomes the guarantor for Bnei Yisrael. Hashem takes it upon himself, this shibud, this obligation, to give the Yidden the koiches, to get rid of this shibud that they became obligated to the Klippos. And here comes the machloikas between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. So the Rebbe says it's known that at the end of the Golus, the darkness is so much greater. And this is why the Gemara at the end of Baba Basra is speaking about this din of someone being strangled. The Yidden are feeling strangled and choked because of the darkness of Golus. So both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi both agree that in the case of someone being strangled, the halacha would be like Rabbi Yishmael, which is that we're going to collect from the Ori, from the guarantor. Which means, despite the fact that there is Midas Hadin, the Midah of judgment, which is arguing and claiming that the Yidden themselves have to pay up, so to speak, the halacha is that the Ori, the guarantor, Hashem, is going to pay up the debts for the Yidden. The difference is only how this shibud exactly happens, how this obligation takes place. From the perspective of Bavli, which, as we said there, the darkness is greater, the achdus with Hashem isn't as noticeable as revealed. So we say you need at least a kinyan. That means the Yidden need to really ask Hashem to put himself into the situation of the Yidden and obligate himself, etc. Whereas from the perspective of the Yerushalmi, which there is felt even more the connection with Hashem in a more revealed way, so all we need to do is just remind Hashem about the pain of his friend. That's what we said in Yerushalmi. Just because of the pain of his friend, it's enough that the Eibishter remembers Kvayachol, that we are in trouble, that we are in distress and captivity of Golus. This happens when we're through us davening and demanding Ad Mosai. That itself is enough that Hashem obligates himself and brings immediately the Geula through Mashiach Tzidkeinu and builds us the third Beis HaMikdash, the last Beis HaMikdash, b'meheira v'yameinu mamash.